Welcome to the Event Manager Podcast by Skift Meetings, the podcast for curious event professionals embracing the future of business events. My name is Miguel Neves, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Skift Meetings. And in this episode titled Deep Dive into Hybrid Events, I have the pleasure of speaking with my friend Gerrit Heijkoop, executive partner at Live Online Events. Our extended conversation runs for almost 2 hours, so make sure you pause and come back to listen to the best bits, but we dive real deep into hybrid events. We talk about things like why some types of events, particularly those that don't have an education or content focus, struggle to work as hybrid events or virtual events. We talk about why in the future, in-person events without an online option are really short-sighted unless they have a strategic and intentional reason for this. We talk about how sponsors are finding good ways of getting value from virtual and hybrid events. We talk about how events really are the best time and place to capture content for really any organization. And we cover 5 different styles of hybrid events that you may want to consider. I hope you'd enjoy listening to this conversation, and don't forget to check out the other episodes of the podcast on our website or through your favorite podcast service. Hello, welcome to the Event Manager Podcast by Skift Meetings. I am delighted to have my friend Gerrit Heijkoop here with us today on the podcast. Welcome, Gerrit.
Good morning, Miguel. Glad to be here with you.
Gerrit, we've known each other for a long time. We've worked together on a number of projects. You are host, producer, part owner of Live Online Events. You've gone through this amazing trajectory of creating, producing, hosting, and doing all sorts of things around hybrid and in-person and virtual events. I'd love you to start to tell us a little bit about your journey with events. And particularly, I always like to start with kind of the first moment where you realized events were a thing, particular business events, and like where was your first contact with the business event industry? And then take us through, today, if you will. Go as fast, as slow as you want to. Just let us know a little bit about your life so far in events.
Well, thank you, Miguel. Let's invite our listeners to take a fresh cup of coffee. This can take a while. No, I'll try to condense it a little bit. But that moment you talk about, that first encounter with the world of business events, I remember very, very vividly. I was graduated as an engineer, actually, at the Technical University of Delft, and started my career in management consultancy. We were part of this high-profile class, and we were educated very well, and we were sent to companies to do all these kind of consultancy kind of gigs. One of the things I came across, a big national company who was moving their headquarters, and I was in charge of that as a young, ambitious professional. And I got a good click with the CEO of that company, and he kind of liked and we talked and we drank coffee a lot. And I told him, one day I want to be an entrepreneur. And I really like to do stuff with events, because during my university times, I'd been involved in organizing events for the student body and all that stuff. So I dropped that at some point. So the funny thing was, this guy figured out this was a talent. I was a talent. So he offered me a job once, twice. I was like, no, I'm in this program. I like it. I stay. So then when the whole move of the headquarters was done, he called me into his office and he said, I heard you like events so much, right? So now that this office is ready, we need to open it. And I want this to be the biggest marketing event of the country in 2007. And you are going to do that for me. I was like, what? Okay. Later, one of my first key learnings was, this is a horrible brief. What do you mean the biggest marketing event of the country? You can go all sides to that. So I had to go back to him. I was like, what do you actually mean? But okay, I was super excited. I got a big budget and off I went. And that's actually when I realized, working with my first agencies, event designers, suppliers, all that stuff that comes around, I realized, wait a second, this is an industry? You can professionally work in events. That's what I want. So pretty soon after that job, I quit my job and started as a freelance event professional. That was around 2008, and a little history setting. That was right after Lehman Brothers fell and the whole events and marketing market just kind of dropped. And here I was as a young, ambitious guy, no network in the industry, no relevant experience, just a lot of drive. And that gave me the opportunity to then walk around, and I started a little tech startup. What's On, you might remember it as well. This was digital program information way before the world of event apps and all that stuff. We were a bit ahead of the market, but we had a lot of fun in trying to figure out how to bring technology into the industry.
Yeah, so that was it was an app as well, but it was a screen, right? We could have information about events, rooms, things like that.
It was amazing vision behind it. We said we need to make use of the cloud, right? Real-time information sharing, regardless of the end device. So you could have your central event information in one place, and then it could be displayed on mobiles, on TV screens in the venue, on your website, all the same information, all the same place. Well, it was really hard to explain that concept to people before the times of mobile apps, cloud, and everything we know now. So, but it was a lot of fun, and it allowed me.
Also,
I was in charge of
entrepreneur is part of your career as well, which is
exactly.
Too much in your bio, but I think it's really interesting that you have that experience as well.
Yeah, and what I really loved about that venture at that time is that, and that this was also part of my education. It's not about what technology can do. It's about how you can make technology useful for, in this case, events. And that game I really, really loved, and that's why I saw a lot of people struggle. Also, other tech suppliers, they really come from, this is what technology enables. Yeah, well, dive a little bit into the world of events and figure out what events need. And if you can tie those two together, then you might have something at your hands that's really useful. So I love that. To be honest, in that team, I was responsible for sales and marketing. And one of the things I started to do is step on the stages of the different industry events, like IMAX and like all the others, and do a talk on social media. It was almost coincidental because our What's On tool also had like a little Twitter ticker tape in it. This was now 2009, 2010. Twitter was really becoming a thing in the events industry, and I knew how that worked, and I could explain that and made that a little fun. And one thing led to another, that after 3 years, we kind of dropped the whole What's On thing. It didn't really fly. I don't know why. Probably a lot of failures on our side as well. But I did get a lot of fun in being on stage and doing the social media talks. And my business partner at the time, Donald Roos, he had a lot of fun in kind of tweaking and designing stuff. So that's when we launched How Can I Be Social, the first ever social media consultancy firm for events and conferences. And that was some good fun years in the middle of the social media revolution. I was able to write a book about that and a lot of stuff. You and I worked a lot together at that time. But in parallel, we are now talking about 2010, 2011-ish. A few things happened. Internet speed came up. YouTube became more mature. Live streaming technology was more and more available and feasible with the internet speeds at the time. 10 years later, you can barely think of that being an issue, but it was an issue back at the time.
I mean, those are kind of like the pre-existing or the kind of new conditions that enabled hybrid and all sorts of things to happen, right?
Exactly. That was what I was getting at. Twitter was a big thing. Hashtag event profs was a big thing on Twitter, and it created this kind of international community of people who were thinking ahead and excited about new possibilities in the events industry. And around the hashtag events profs, some experiments started to happen with hybrid events. And I happened to be part of that very early group, and we had a lot of fun, and we tried a lot of stuff. Ruud Janssen was essential in that development as well. We did different kind of experiments. It was the event camp series of events together. Out of that, we ended up at the Fresh conference, Maarten van Est, who launched that. And there was also a lot of experimentation going on with both event designs, but also event technology and bringing those together. And that's where we really started to play that game of hybrid events, where we said, okay, live streaming is a technology, but how do we make live streaming fun? How do we create an experience for someone who is not physically at the event that is attractive, that is sticky, that is worthwhile? And there we kind of learned a few of the basics that I think are still very true for anyone involved in hybrid events today.
It's interesting. I was just thinking how, if you were to plot a timeline, do you have any idea in comparison to live streaming from the gaming perspective and e-gaming and that things? Do you have any idea? Like, was this before all that, or was e-gaming in
I would say yes.
that sense? Okay. So that
No,
doesn't
now
really
now now
explode
you
until
apply
later.
to my no, now you apply to my knowledge as the engineer, and this is all about CPU computer capacity. And you might be aware that gaming requires a lot of resources from the computer. So online gaming is kind of the next step, both for the computer and also for bandwidth and all that stuff on. So no, that revolution was definitely, I would say, about 5 to 8 years later. So like in the second half of the 2010s to 2020.
But it's important, right? Because I think where we are right now, particularly with the virtual events pivots during the pandemic and boost, a lot of the hardware that I'm using right now, like I'm using a HyperX microphone. This is a gaming microphone. The reason it's got a big red light on it is because it's designed for gamers. So I feel like most of this sort of like home style hardware, which has enabled people to have kind of home studios all around the world, is only really possible because of this big gaming and kind of live streaming revolution, right? It's sort of, it kind of collides in the last few years.
I agree. It was definitely a big technological push. And if it's funny, if we continue this from my introduction to the history of hybrid events, but those go a little bit in parallel. What you saw is that actually hybrid events were named the number one trend in the events industry. I remember in 2013, 14, 15-ish maybe. That's about the time when we also went full on with live online events. Gerrit Schroeders and I came together. Gerrit was already experimenting with this. And besides hybrid events, also event reporting, social media reporting for events. Since 2010, I was on the side. We both worked together on projects. And in 2014, we really joined forces because this was a big thing. And you saw a lot of big corporations going hybrid with their sales and marketing events. A lot of people. But now I realized, after knowing what came after, that was a bit of the gimmick thing, right? This was the new thing in events and conferences. Let's try it. Everyone wants something new all the time. So this was the new thing. So what I never got my head around is that after 3 years, this hype kind of went by. It died out. Either corporations kind of did it internally, and then for really low cost, and I would say from a design perspective, really crappy. But hey, if this is something you do a lot with your international corporation, I can imagine you're not slamming a lot of money onto that every month. And on the association side, the perk or the new thing was a bit gone. So they moved on to then the next big thing in tech, which was probably the event app or whatever. And those were kind of, those were in competition, it seemed. So by the time we hit 2017, 18, 19, our company, Live Online Events, was also more and more transitioning. We still did hybrid events, but we also went big into content production, right? So video, promo videos, podcasting, event reports, anything related to online content at events, whether this was really live on a live stream or just on social media or surrounding. Well, and then I think if we're there already, March 2020 hit, and we were kind of pulled off our chairs like, hey, we literally did in March 2020, we pivoted events in 3 days. Let's not say multiple events. One event, obviously you can only do this once in 3 days, but the whole thing locked down. They had their big 2-day conference the week after, and on Monday we started talking and working, and on Thursday, Friday, we were 2 days live online.
Wow.
But this is a virtual event, eh?
Okay.
Yeah, this is a virtual event then, because this is what happened in the pandemic. Everybody learned that there is a way to bring an audience together fully online as well. I'm not saying that's preferable. I'm not saying that's better, but it is a means of communication.
I was just thinking as you were talking that if we were to plot a graph, 3 graphs in my mind of kind of hardware and software capabilities. Relatively steady, maybe exponential, but relatively steady growth. Possibly during the pandemic, if you look at software by itself, that definitely has a peak, right? You have these tools.
The platforms, a lot of people dived into the platforms, improved platforms, because all of a sudden, remember, and this is also, again, if I look at the industry, all that venue budget, so to say, all the budget that normally went to the venues and to the catering, now all of a sudden was available for the platforms, and they, in some cases, took advantage of that. Let's try to stay diplomatic here.
No, let's jump in. I mean, if you want to. Did you see
No,
examples of platforms kind of asking for way too much money for what they're providing?
yes, I've seen things happen in the market and budgets and quotations being made but also let's also look at the meeting owners and planners. Budgets being spent on stuff that I think, how can you ever make that justified? But again, like I said, the budget was on the table, right? Because normally there's a lot of costs involved with venuing and catering and all that stuff. So I think
Do
the
you
money
still
was
see
just
this
moved.
now, though, or is this something that sort of
No, that's what I'm
flipped?
getting to. Let's date this podcast. We are now in September 2022, and what was the news also on Skift meetings in the last 6 months? That all of a sudden, all these big platforms that came up in the last 2 years were laying off people, and the budgets were slashed. Well, yeah, it makes sense, because earlier this year a lot of things were possible again. A lot of people went back to physical meetings, so that budget is now back to venues and catering.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, for mine, I think it's more complex than that, and we could probably do a whole
Of
podcast
course,
just on this.
I agree. I am simplifying. I'm fully aware
Sure.
of that. Yeah.
I guess the point I wanted to make is that there's, virtual platforms will say, hey, we have these costs, there's streaming servers, there's things that happen that I think it's easy for planners to assume that everything just shows up. You're used to kind of turning on Zoom and having 500 people on Zoom and it just works. And it's not so easy, when you do it in a platform, et cetera. So there's certain things that have to happen, and especially service and kind of making sure everything happens. So there are hard costs there. On the flip side, I think from the attendee perspective, I think attendees are very used to, if there's food involved, if there's a room involved, if there's a physical kind of AV involved, you understand kind of what you're paying for. When you pay for a virtual event, it's much more abstract. And I think maybe that'll change over the years. But there's this weird kind of like, wait, I just turn on Zoom and this works. Why am I going to pay, I don't know, $200 to be on this virtual event? Like, that doesn't make sense in people's heads. So I think when it comes to budgets and value or value perception, it feels like we're still finding our feet when it comes to hybrid and virtual events.
All right. So, Miguel, let's make this podcast a little bit provoking, right? That's in the end more interesting for listeners. I would say we spoke to each other last week in the event Design Summit. If you think from a design perspective, I would argue that a virtual participant doesn't need that much mirrors and smoke in terms of platform. And now I'm going to kick some people in the shins, I'm aware. And yes, I've also seen beautiful platform solutions, and it works smooth and it's almost an experience. But let's be honest, for the majority of the events who just want to reap the benefit of the opportunity to treat the walls and the roof of their physical meeting, a online technology that provides a camera feed, good audio, and an opportunity to do some light interaction, whether it's in chat, one-on-one, on one on multi, and some polling, is basically everything you need. Because from there on, it depends really on what you do with it. Do you have good content that's suited for online on that camera feed? Does the person who is on your stage or on your camera say something on that audio that makes sense? And have you created small interactions via chat or polling that are actually fun and engaging your audience? All the other stuff is just, it's nice, but to me, it's not essential to have a valuable virtual participation in either a hybrid or a virtual event.
I think you make some great points, and I tend to agree with you. I see there being sort of three forces pulling in somewhat opposite directions. I see the production AV platform people kind of going, hey, what you need is a video feed that looks really good, and you need to go into like vMix and do all these fancy things and get the speakers, all that, and that's what's going to make it amazing. I see the content people, particularly kind of like, the specific medical content, that kind of thing, pushing towards what we need is the real experts. So we need content curation. We need this thing over here. And then I see the kind of hosting, moderating, facilitation people. What you need is real interaction and design of interaction between people. And I feel like, the ideal is probably to get a balance of all three.
Right.
But those three don't necessarily
the magic
agree.
is in The magic is in the center of those three circles. If you make these three circles and then they coincide in the middle, because all of it is true, but all of it can also compensate each other. So let's go through your circles again. I agree that a very well AV technically produced live stream, let's say television-like, enhances the experience of a virtual participant, especially if the importance or the relevance or the urgency of the content for this participant is not so high, right? Because all of a sudden we talked about that scale from information to experience. If there's less relevance, urgency for the content, then obviously experience becomes more important to keep me engaged, and a great AV quality TV style production is then part of an experience. So spot on, they are right, but each planner or designer needs to determine where am I on that scale. So how important is it for me? And this is also related to budget. On the content side, it's the same thing. Some events do not lean as much on content as they think, right? Especially pre-COVID, a lot of events were out there just for people to get out of the office, to have a nice trip, and I'm not undermining the value of that. It's very valuable. But the content is in some of the cases almost a little bit of an excuse to make sure that people can justify the time and the effort and the spend to come to the event.
Is there a virtual equivalent of that, or an online equivalent of that? Is that when the video production is really fancy, but there's, things aren't that interesting that are happening in the video?
I think those are the virtual events that fail, right? The ones that were traditionally much more about the experience, the networking, the traveling, to getting out of the office together or whatever, and were not that strong or important on the content as an excuse, let's coin that phrase. If you take that to the virtual world, that's going to fail. On the other hand, there are definitely summits, medical or scientific conferences on which the content is the key spearhead of what's happening there. And for those, back to that scale of AV quality versus content, if the content is urgent and relevant and important to the participant, you can get away, you can have great Zoom webinars, Zoom meetings, all that stuff, who are low tech, right? We do a monthly Ask Me Anything series on YouTube. I am Zooming with a leading expert in a certain industry. We kick off the conversation. We broadcast live on YouTube, and it's been going for 3 years now, 28 episodes, and people love it. It's super low tech, but it is what it promises. It's nice. It's fun. I guess that's what we also got stuck in the last 2 years. In the last 2 years, during the COVID pandemic, virtual events had to be the replacement of a physical event.
Yeah.
And so, I would be the first to argue that is what it never could be. Right? Let that sink in a little bit. A virtual participation could be a very good alternative for a physical event, but it's not a replacement of. And I think that was what a lot of us were struggling with during that COVID, right? When virtual was the only option. And I think that has led to some interesting experiments.
Would you say then that it is, if an event is content light, an in-person event is content light, then it doesn't really work virtually?
It's really, really challenging. And for those listeners who weren't part of the Event Design Summit last week, we talked about this scale. And let me underline again, I'm saying scale. I'm not saying opposites. I saw some conversation in the chat about that. The scale from information-driven to experience-driven and anything in between. But anything, any event or any objective that is really leaning on sharing information, education, those are very suitable for online participation. Let's face it, a presentation and Ask Me Anything, just me sitting here with some notes and learning and educating. I'm the first to say that you learn much more skills by doing or exchanging with people. That's fine, but it's not always an option. And then the more the experience becomes more important, whether it's the serendipity meetings, whether it's the doing business with looking each other in the eye, whether it's really working together on a new innovation, on a project plan in a working group. That stuff, especially if you don't know each other yet, works really well physically. You see, I'm walking a little bit on eggs with my words, because otherwise the next one is going to come, oh, I have had great working groups online. Yes, it's possible. But it's just, especially with people you don't know, it's much easier to do a physical kickoff and then do a series of virtual, right? That might be working really well.
I mean, I'm a living example of that. I worked with Skift meetings for a year before I met anybody from my team personally. And as soon as I met everybody in person, I felt much more part of a bigger thing than just working on a job by myself. So I think that happens for everybody.
Yeah, so let me add two things to round up this conversation. One optimistic thing. Well, yeah, both are positive messages. But I think that is the core of the future of physical events, is that creating the new connections, right? And making people feel belong and together. Yet after that, a lot of work or information sharing, all that other stuff can be also done very well online. And the other thing I think is hopefully positive, but a bit of a challenge. Let's say it like that. I believe that in 2022 and after, if you choose to create a physical event on top of which you do not create a virtual participation layer, i.e. a hybrid event, I think you're making yourself unnecessary exclusive. And as long as that is a design choice, then it's fine. If you're saying, we are doing this conference, this event, this kickoff, this summit, and it's for a very targeted, very exclusive event, and it's fine. Let's do it physical. Let's make them do all the effort of traveling and getting here and getting out of the office. It's a choice. But a lot of people who are working in events, designing events, financing events, have an objective of reaching as many people in the community as they can. Well, let's face it, then all that investment that you place into that physical event, I would say I won't say you're crazy. It would be a great missed opportunity if you do not leverage that into an additional layer of audience in a virtual world.
Well, I'm glad you went there, because I know we wanted to also cover this idea of what is a hybrid event. And let's cover that. I have mixed feelings about this question, because I feel to some extent it's a bit of we go around in circles, and do we need to have semantics. An exact definition? Exactly.
Yeah. Yes and no. Let's, before we spend a few minutes on this, agree that this is semantics. Mm-hmm. But what I notice is that a lot of people have different definitions of hybrid events. And then it becomes difficult to have a good design conversation, or to get a budget together, or to be successful in it. To me, I take the definition as broad as possible, where I say any occasion can be anything, any type of event, where both a physical and an online audience are involved or targeted or part of. Some people I've encountered walk around the globe who believe that the only hybrid event that exists is an occasion where both the physical and the online audience have the exact same program, experience, or whatever. And to them, I just say, well, that is a flavor of a hybrid event. For me, that is not the hybrid event. But I've been into interesting discussions with some people about that. So I learned from that. Let's at least clarify what my definition is, and then they can choose whatever they find their definition.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, some people have this argument of like, what is a real hybrid event? And I guess it's kind of the same conversation. But I think when we spoke last week, I got the feeling that, you've seen, I wouldn't say you've seen it all, but you've seen a lot more than many people have that have been doing in-person and virtual events and hybrid events. And it's more kind of saying, I got the feeling you were saying we don't really need to force this, right? It's about designing experiences. You can have interactions between online and offline audiences, but it's important to design those intentionally and to kind of make those work and not sort of force this copycat of an in-person event onto a virtual event. Is that your feeling?
Yeah, I think you summarized that very well. I think that is key, and it's a message I've been able to repeat on the Skift platforms as well. I truly believe if we really, and it's a little bit abstract. I have a ton of examples for you later as well. But if we go really abstract and say we look at this occasion, event, conference, trade show, whatever type of event it is, let's face it, this is a means of communication. This is something that belongs in the communication mix of emailings, advertising, website, social media, event. It's just another form to communicate with a target audience, i.e. your employees, i.e. your potential clients or current clients, your members of your association, whatever. It has some specific characteristics. It requires a lot of time and energy and resources, both from you as an organizer as from the participant to all the way get there. That means it also has some characteristics in terms of attention, effect, potential of transformation, right? It's a super interesting means of communication. But if you look at it like that, it also starts to make sense that then if you add a virtual component where you reach people to a website, to a live stream, to a live chat, to social media, you then realize, oh, wait a second, I'm just actually adding other means of communication to that same target audience. And that's when I really get to a point, wait a second, but then these audiences are so different, right? Here we have the people who are physically there. They traveled, they're in the room, they have other sensory experiences. And here we have the people who either are not allowed to travel because they're in a tier in the organization that is not allowed to come to the event, or they don't have the budget, they don't have the time, there's security reasons, whatever. That alone already makes these people so different, with different needs, with different metrics of success, with different attention spans, with different budgets. You know, if you would do a proper marketing persona of these, they're so different. I think you would immediately understand. I then also need to design a different experience for them that caters to their specific needs and circumstances.
Yeah. I think that's you're talking about.
Because now I'm saying as if it's fully two events. We're still talking about hybrid events. What makes it hybrid? Well, we still do that around the same occasion, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's our annual conference, whether it's our big corporate event, whatever. So the occasion is kind of the linking pin between these two audiences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in the idea that you build up to something, right? And that's where the hybrid really works, because some of the examples or some of the ideas that you shared on the hybrid side is that idea that the online can be at any time, right? The time frame of the online audience is much more flexible or can be experimented with. You can do lots of different things. And I really like that. I really like that idea that you can open up to all these different options. But at the same time, I do fear that if you don't give people this kind of peak of attention, this moment in time where everybody's going to be focused on this thing, it gets dispersed, right? And then it sort of becomes like, why should I be online on the 12th of September to do this?
Exactly. No, so here, what you just touched on is the power of hybrid events. This is why hybrid events, and again, I said on the virtual summit, hybrid events, let's all realize, people, this is a production term. We, the planners, designers, suppliers, consider something a hybrid event. A participant is just either a physical or an online participant. They don't know what hybrid is, or at least it means less to them than to us. But the great opportunity you have as a planner, what makes a hybrid event different from a podcast, a webinar, or some other virtual event, is the momentum of the physical. Because chances are huge that you are targeting both the physical as the online attendance to the same community. So people will see people in their environment on social media posting that they're traveling to the event, whether it's a national or international event, that they're going there, that they're in this beautiful scenery. There is momentum around the physical event, and that is what you really try to capture. So I'm a strong believer in that the online or virtual side of the hybrid event is on the same day, on the same moment. That is like we consider about 4 or 5 formats of hybrid events, and in the first 3, everything is still happening at the same time. And to me, the most classic fundamental format of a good virtual layer on a hybrid event is the way sports is being televised, right? Mm-hmm. There is the stadium, there's a pitch, there's a match going to happen, it starts at time X, and around that we create something to lead you in. We have a studio show where we kind of preview what's going to happen, we kind of set the scene, we set the context, then cameras turn to the pitch, watch the match during a break, maybe even we switch back to the studio, we analyze, we add a little commercial break for our sponsors, and then we go back and then on. I think that was the format we pretty soon started experimenting with at, for example, Fresh in 2013 and 14. And to me, that's kind of still one of the fundamentals that can create something really attractive for a virtual participant.
So I guess, are you saying then that a relatively simple way for people to think about hybrid events is to think about it being the TV transmission of their event?
Exactly that. And then we also get to a point, because I realized about 20 minutes ago in a conversation, you start talking about the three forces that we're pulling. And we talked about two, technology, production, and content, but you also mentioned the hosting and engaging. And that is where that really comes into play, that you have a dedicated host with like an expert on the side. Really look at any sports match at your television. They have done this for 50 years, I think. They know how to keep a remote audience engaged to the stadium.
Yeah. But yeah, I think part of me is hosting, engaging. I think that interaction with the audience, I feel like that's a really important bit. Probably one of the most underdeveloped bits, or not too many events take that seriously. I feel like most events that I've seen go virtual focus much more on the production and then on the content side. And I feel like that's a sort of third element that gets a little bit neglected. But I've also been at events that are all about interaction and kind of almost not really ignore, but kind of say like, we actually don't need a lot of content. If like an Ask Me Anything, like you just talking about, right? That's very much about the interaction. It's like, it's not like you've prepared hours and hours of study to be there. You've just said, hey, I'm here. I want to engage. Let's talk. And maybe, I don't know how much video production, I'm sure it doesn't look bad, but I'm sure you're not going into a massive TV studio, et cetera, to do that either, right? So you're kind of focusing on that third and kind of saying, hey, this event is just about interaction. It's just about kind of engaging with people.
Yeah, and let's remind everyone that is the magic of live events. The whole difference between a pre-recorded podcast or video and a live event, whether it's physical or online, is the magic of unpredictability. And you create the unpredictability by giving the audience the floor, because as soon as that happens, we create something that is only happening because these people are at this moment in time together, whether that is virtually or physical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so fascinating. I mean, it's hybrid events is such an interesting area. Do you predict, or do you anticipate that we're going to kind of see this peak of interest? We talked about the chart earlier, and we didn't actually. I was thinking about three charts, and the third one was actually the interest in hybrid events. You know, and you said, like 2010 to 2013, they were kind of the new thing on the block, and they were exciting.
Yeah, I would say all the way to 15, 16, it was a big thing.
But
then it dropped
I didn't
off.
feel like there was a massive peak. There was sort of like the geeks among us are experimenting and doing things, and you hear this thing bubbling, right? But it
was part of let's try something new. Let's make this hybrid. Yeah.
And we saw a lot of big events, PCMA, MPI, within the event industry that they did live streams.
But also big association conferences. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. They weren't actually necessarily calling them hybrid, but there was a sort of there was a streaming element to them. And then you sort of, I guess it sort of lost interest at some point, and I can't really explain why. I don't know if you have any theories of why, like 16
what
to
I said,
20
my theory
was
then we tried that for 2-3 years in a row, and now and let's face it, it's pretty expensive. It's the business model is one of the most challenging thing, because you have double the target audience, but also not double, but you have a very significant additional cost for that virtual participant. And definitely at that time, 2015-16, there was no way you were going to make people pay for that, right? So it was always pre-COVID. The hybrid event was mostly the marketing of the next edition. And you would always see that happen. So people who attended virtually said, oh my God, this is such a great event. I want to be part of this next time. But there's a challenge for the event planner because those attendees of next year do not cover your budget of this year, right? So there was also always this imbalance that you had to have some kind of investment budget available for experimentation or new stuff or marketing. Mm-hmm. So that's where these 2014 to 17 hybrid events were paid from, I think. And when the business model didn't become sustainable, that lost interest. And the next new thing came on.
Do you think that is changing? Are you seeing events that have a solid business model for the virtual as well? Like, can events monetize the virtual audience adequately?
Yes, I would say very well. Let's start with a specific niche. Any people and mainly associations dealing with permanent education requirements, mm-hmm. they can very easily capitalize on the education that they make virtual. Because there, the business case for the participants is so easy. I either have to go off my office and travel all the way to where, or I can just from the comfort of my own home, get my education, get my points, obligations, that's all set.
So does this mean there's a merging then of events, and in this case, the virtual type of events with continuous online education? They start to blur a little bit?
I would say yes. And obviously, the conferences where this was a part of was already a very information-driven, information-sharing type of audience. Again, so they're very suitable for this as well. Mm-hmm. Again, let's not forget many of these scientific conferences, which are accredited for permanent education points, still have a big element of the school trip, let's get out of the office perk. So let's not ignore that. This is kind of an under the radar force that we cannot openly talk about, but should be aware about.
I think that's always a big factor. I do think some academic and many conferences have things to discuss that only happen in that room and demonstrations that only happen in that space. But that's a minority, right? That's 10% or that's
and let's face it, that exclusivity, that safety can also easily be technologically created online. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's an element because the element of trust comes on, and you better trust someone when you look them face to face in a closed physical room. I agree. Yeah. Next type of audience. So permanent education requirements is the easiest one. But something else has happened due to the last 2 years of immense virtual events, good and bad. Let's focus on the good. Is that also the sponsor side has experienced that there are opportunities. Mm-hmm. Yes, we've also seen very big failing things that do not work for corporate sponsorship. Sponsorship is still pretty tough. On the other hand, let's go to the fundamental classic means of televising events. Like I already mentioned, they just have big commercial breaks around the sport match break. So I think sponsorships or companies, sponsoring companies are now also warming up to the idea that they can just fill in their sponsorship with a 30-second commercial clip, and then they're willing to put cash on the table for that.
And I guess makes a good business case for having this TV style production, because you're opening up for these TV style sponsorships. If you don't have a TV style production and you try to just stream sort of semi-independently, then you don't have those moments.
This program is brought to you by sponsor XYZ. Now I just
you mentioned I guess we haven't jumped into the examples. I mean, you shared a few examples at the event last week, and I thought they were really interesting and well received. Of course, we're in audio only, so it makes it even doubly challenging. But are there any examples from your kind of recent experience with hybrid events that you wanted to highlight as successful, and that we could kind of take some learnings from?
Yeah, let me go through a few examples. I got my thought back, which I just lost. I wanted to add on the sponsorship thing. The compelling argument that you can sell to your sponsors is that when they are or were a sponsor for your physical event, they only have exposure to your community on that one day, on that one place. the beauty of being a sponsor of the virtual side of the event is that you take away the factor time, because one of the other basics, maybe not for everyone that's already there, but to me a basic is that once you invest in the cameras and the AV production and televising or whatever, recording all that content of your event, the easiest thing is to create a business model out of the content on demand side of things. And obviously your sponsors can be very easily be part of that as well. So their reach and brand awareness and exposure is much bigger in a hybrid event than just in a physical event.
And again, a great business case made there for doing something good when you do online, right? And not something that maybe only makes sense at that moment in time, but something that you can reuse and that has value for the audience,
right?
Ongoing.
It was my third tip in the top 3 tips video from 2021. Think about the repurposing of the content before your event, because then you can very easily record little transitions or different intros for the post-event stuff, whatever. You can use your event as a content production day, because that's actually what it should be. Just a little addition on the sponsorship side, and hopefully helping planners and meeting owners to actually make that sell a little bit easier than it sounds. Yeah. By the way, when you say that means why it's so important to do things good, I hope with that good you weren't referring to expensive AV production quality, because creative sponsorship exposure can also be very well done in a Zoom webinar. Eh? I mean, those little commercial breaks can also be part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just an argument for thinking about things in the long term. You know, it's not necessarily...
Agree.
I think the production is important.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's important, but the most important thing is to think about it long term. And I think we've talked about this before. When we're creating even live streams for Facebook, the ideal situation is that somebody can watch that in a month or 2 months' time and still get something out of it, right? If it's something that only really makes sense at that moment, then it better be really popular and the whole internet better be watching, because or else it feels a bit pointless, right?
Agree, fully agree. And we're getting such in a rabbit hole, but to build on that, and there is also, unfortunately nowadays, a little value for, let's call it, hygiene social media content, meaning that people almost expect it to be normal that if an event is taking place, there's some real-time coverage on the social media channels. If only like some video reels or whatever of what is it like, or some photos of what is it like to be there. So that is something you also need to think of in your content planning, right? Some stuff needs to be fast and quick out there. The other stuff needs to be more thought through and be available for the long term.
Yeah, let me just drill down a little bit on that, and
we get to the example soon, dear listener.
I know. So I recently came across a story that I think we're going to cover, which is all about the speed of publishing content. And the idea being that, doing hybrid live streaming a whole bunch of content can get very expensive, especially if you have multiple rooms, etc. But if you can find a way to capture it with, good enough quality and release it same day or kind of like next day when that attention peak is still there, the chances of your audience consuming that content go up by something like 5-10 times, because it's that kind of peak of attention. And I've just wondered if that was your experience, if you agree, if that's your experience, and if you've seen examples of this really working well. And I'm kind of saying like, hey, not everybody can afford to multi-stream everything, but let's capture it quickly and get it out there. Is that your advice as well?
Well, I'm confused by you mentioning the multiple rooms, because if you mention multiple rooms, I immediately think on a conference style thing. So I also think on a purpose or an objective of education.
Yeah.
And for those type of events, I would say having everything real time out there would let's flip this. Yes, it's an opportunity, but also a huge investment. So I think you can afford educational content on demand to arrive later as well, because this stays relevant for a much longer time than only that day. Yeah. However, what I do agree with you is that during the event, you want to capture the momentum, perhaps to sell to your video on demand platform, or to kind of capture that awareness and attention and then reel people into your community. And therefore, and I'll be careful not to make this a promotional talk, but with live online events, we do a lot of these social media reporting teams. Like last week, it was the big European dermatology conference, and we were there with a team of a videographer, a photographer, 3 social media content posters and interactors, and like a senior editor who was overlooking that whole team. And they were dang all over the place. Interviews, atmosphere, everything, and just filling the social medias, and especially with all these stories and reels nowadays. It's only 24 hours available. Yet, like I said, that's what I meant with the hygiene factor. If it's not there, people get this little eerie feeling like, is this thing even taking place?
Yeah, that sometimes happens to me, actually. As you know, I'm not someone who spends a lot of time on Instagram, and I go and check out the Instagram account of a certain event, and then I don't see anything, and it feels very strange. No. And then I remember,
because in their urgency to make all these stories, they forget actually to do the regular posts as well, right? Exactly. And then there's nothing left. Yeah.
So you kind of say, that feels a bit sparse, but I think if you're following and if you're engaged, then it's a whole different story.
Yeah,
but I think you make an excellent point. So it's this whole thing about being very fast in publishing, I think makes sense. But what I understood from what you were saying is that yes, it makes sense, but you should probably select which content it makes sense. It doesn't make sense to publish all sessions immediately, even if you can. It's more about
and you are quoting research, so I'm a bit careful because this is just my line of rational thinking. But if I go back to my basics of the 2 different audiences with the 2 different needs, I would say educational sessions have a much longer shelf life than capturing the momentum of the excitement, which I want to use to reel in people to my community.
Absolutely. And I think, even if it is proven research, I think we have to put things in perspective, because even if it's much cheaper to record and publish than to live stream, there's still a big expense in trying to do many, many sessions at once, right? So it's important to select the ones that are important, as you say. And if it is continuing education credits, if that's the idea that it just becomes part of a portfolio of online content, then it doesn't actually matter. I guess you're still going to get more views on things if it's up very quickly after it was recorded. So I think it still applies, but you have to probably measure out cost benefit ratio, like which ones are you going to prioritize?
And so what is the smart design in between? Let's capture on this research and make sure we have stuff available on demand super quickly for those who get excited by the social media covers or whatever and say, I want to be part of this now. Okay, so for you, we got this track. Okay, let's go to an example. One we mentioned in the summit as well. At the ESOT conference, this is the European Society of Organ Transplantation. This is a pre-COVID example. This is a 3,500 association conference. They have 3 big, almost plenary halls. That's how big they are. And they have this multiple breakouts, all these rooms where all these different topics are being discussed, presentations being done. For the virtual side of things, we selected just the 3 main rooms to create the live streaming and the video on demand for. In the other rooms, a lot of stuff was also captured and recorded and made available on demand later. But that had a much longer time frame. And yet at the 3 big rooms, what we did, so one of them was selection of content. Are we going to live stream, record everything? No, let's focus on the most important, the big sessions, so to speak. Yep. Also still part of a marketing thought. Let's make sure that people understand how important this conference is so they come physically next time. Another innovation we designed in was that we said, okay, thinking about our target audience, which was in this case global, how are you going to work with the different time zones? We are all aware that there's this European 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock kind of sweet point where you should be able to get a global audience live at the same time. Yet, hey, why not give something else to people in either Asia or the Americas at the times when we in Copenhagen were in our hotel room? So we created a 24-hour live stream where we would live stream the main room during the day, or room 1 and 2. At the same time, everything else in 2 and 3 was recorded. So that was then, talking about speed of publishing, as soon as the live would stop, let's say at 5:30 at the end of the day, the recording of room 2 was then being published all the way through the night, and then room 3 was added. And by the time we made that full circle, then we would rebroadcast the live stream of room 1, because now people in Asia would have woken up and they wouldn't have been able to see the afternoon of that. So that's how we stitched the whole thing kind of around the globe.
Why rebroadcast and not just publish and make available on demand during that time period?
Yeah, because we want in marketing the virtual side of the event, we wanted to make it as simple as possible. And that came from a development. Now we dive a little bit back into the history of hybrid events. In the years before that, we really thought, okay, to an online audience member, we shouldn't market, hey, this is the online side of this event, but we said, hey, this is a virtual event about topic A, B, or C. Because we would say virtual participants are interested in certain topics, so let's gather them about that. But what that led to was like this massively complicated timetable of then we're live here, and then we're live on that, and then we're live on that. And we said, let's simplify, and let's just say, if you're curious about what's going on at this conference, there's one URL, and any time of the day that you are interested, click on the URL, be part of the event, and then find in your timetable what you're watching and when the next thing is coming out. So again, much more modeled after a TV station. TVs don't go on blank during the night, right? They just keep running.
Yeah. Yes, several things come to mind here. I remember at one point a few years ago, maybe like 10 years ago now, there was this whole idea of 3D TVs, or kind of like watching a football game, a soccer game in 3D. And they were doing some experiments. I remember Sky Sports were doing some experiments. And the idea was that you could sort of almost choose your camera and figure out like what you wanted to watch. And they had this going for a while, and nobody would pay for it. And then they realized that nobody actually wants to play TV producer. What they want is the produced feed, and they can sit back on their couch and really enjoy the game. So the fact that like each player had a camera on them, hypothetically speaking, was a bit pointless, because for the producer, it's useful. For the person watching at home, they're like, no, just give me the produced thing. So I think that's kind of what you're saying.
I mean, TV directing is a skill. That director creates a story through the content, or in this case, time to match. And this is fun. We talked in the beginning of our conversation, if people are still there, about technology push. What is technologically possible and what is needed from a participant. I think offering 20 parallel streams is almost getting to that. On the one hand, you could say, well, this is the most personalized experience that we could offer. Yeah, well, just give me one experience that's really good, or maybe 2 or 3, whatever, but curate for me. And then you have as a kind of a bait, you can say, wow, you want to have access to all the other stuff? Become a member, pay for our video on demand platform, whatever. And then there's much more time on your side.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention is, with the example you gave with ESOT, you chose to only live stream the main stages. And I think there's a sort of a TEDx or TED factor to that, where those stages look good, right? When you watch those videos, you're like, oh, cool, there's a big stage and there's a speaker and there's a very rehearsed presentation. When you're live streaming the breakout rooms and the smaller rooms, a lot of times, they're darker rooms and there's somebody just standing in front of the room.
Yeah,
exactly. And yes, you can, spend a lot of money to make those rooms look better, but they're always going to be meeting rooms, right? They're not going to be big production stages with big lightings and all that kind of thing. So I think there's an element of real, I guess, marketing as well, like protecting the image of the event, where you're saying, hey, these ones are like live here. Yes, you can go into the real niche content, but that's going to be like an on-demand thing later on.
Oh, Miguel, that's such a strong point. You need to think about, what do you want your event to look like on the internet, right? Because that image is really going to determine what kind of feeling I get from it. So I think indeed, if I would be designing a virtual, because again, this whole conversation that we have, Miguel, it's about event or hybrid event design, right? And in the end, you cannot say this is the archetype of a house. This is design work, different preferences, different needs, all that stuff. So let's again underline, I am sharing how I would design stuff in a kind of a general context. And for case specific situations, there might be specific needs.
And
one of the
I
other
wanted to bring
things
back one more thing. Hold on, before we move on. So you talked about, live or kind of almost live, having these big stages streamed, impressive, like a main TV feed, let's say. And I was kind of thinking, for the most of the people, I think that's going to be where they're going to go, right? And I think that's what you were kind of saying. It's really important to have this like one point where they go, and from beginner to kind of very expert, that's a place to start. What about the people that are really looking for very specific content? Do you see examples where there's ways of like capturing what they're looking for, so that when that session becomes available, you kind of send it to them? Is that sort of part of the thinking there?
I like it. It's smart. So what you're now saying, this is smarter event marketing in a sense that you try to profile your community by interest and really can target specific content to them. I referenced earlier briefly that we have about 5 different formats. 3 of them all evolve around the same day. But what you're now saying is very related to a format where you pull, you mentioned that earlier, where you pull also time apart of your different means of communications, where you, for example, say, we create a series of online events, let's say webinars or virtual events, whatever, leading up to a physical combination of things. You could even say you are only allowed to or come to the physical event if you participate in 3 out of the 5 online events, whatever. And that format then also allows you to do this, what you're exactly saying, Miguel, say like, we have 5 webinars up front. One is fully focused on topic A, one on B, one on C, one on D. You're fine just going for B because that's your topic of interest, and then come to a big physical event where we have A, B, and C and D all at the same time, and we have like a multidisciplinary conversation.
Yeah, it's that, taking time. The online audience time is much more flexible, so you can play with that and kind of figure out different things out.
So and that's what I'm doing. What you did, you threw a design challenge at me, like saying, you're treating the audience as one big mass. What about if they have a specific interest? Well, okay, so we can go into 2 directions. Either we do, like we already mentioned, we do like 20 parallel streams, so every niche kind of has their own thing, massive budget, massive complexity, a lot of stuff going on. Or we say, no, let's be smart. A virtual audience has time has a different perspective. I'm not bound by the limitations of having an audience only 1, 2, or 3 days. So let's see if I can do it like that. And I think this is what I like. This is designing, right?
Yeah, I always feel like you want to like, okay, so I'm the expert. I'm looking for this one particular niche session or niche topic. I go in, and if I can see that there's, I don't know, almost like a placeholder for that recording, and it's not available yet, but I can kind of say, hey, sign up here. We'll let you know as soon as this thing is uploaded and edited. That makes me feel good, right? Because it's like, it has what I need. It's maybe not quite ready now, so I'm not as happy, but at least I know I'm being taken care of, rather than just having like, there's this big TV feed, but I can't get to where I want to be, right? So I'm trying to like get the best of both worlds for the people that are looking for that kind of content.
I love it. And it reminds me of a little hack we always used to do. Instead of making people register for virtual participation, we would just say, leave your email address here if you want to be notified when we go live. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing, but again, we flipped it because we put it there as a service to them, and at the same time, we're capturing information and email addresses and anything we want from them. But
absolutely, so it's good marketing, right? You're not saying give us your information because we want to have your information. It's we're going to make this useful for you.
Yeah, exactly. Let's this is the longest episode of the Event Manager podcast ever, I'm afraid. But let's do some more examples, because there's a nice bridge between what we did at ESOT in 2019 and an innovative event we did in 2021, which is somewhat still in the COVID side, and that is the concept of hubs or co-locations or viewing parties. We have different names for them, but where we invite people, like in the ESOT case, we invited sponsors. Here's another business model because there was something that was also being sold. We invited the sponsors or facilitated the sponsors to create a physical event at their location in their country around a specific session that was being live streamed. And then we added some additional perks like two-way communication with them. So we would also bring them into the physical room and people could wave. Let's not forget, this is something pretty simple, but it works for both the remote and the physical audience, because the physical audience becomes aware. Wait a second, it's not only me in this big room, but there's people around the world who are now also participating. And also, of course, for the remotes, they feel like, oh, we got on stage in Copenhagen, right? This is fun.
Yeah. Let me just clarify, because I think it would be good to put some more meat on this before you go into your example. So you're talking about ESOT. This was the 3,500 person conference in Copenhagen with the live streams, etc. And then you had, I think it was 4 locations in China where there was
10.
a group.
10.
Okay, but there was 4 on camera, right? And then there were other ones.
Maybe in the photo you saw, but in there were 10 locations virtually connected with a two-way connection
across China. I think in China, and they each had maybe a few hundred people in the room, so it was a pretty big room in itself. And then I guess the head of each delegation in those rooms in China had the opportunity, not as the speakers were live on the stage, but then the speakers were brought into a kind of TV interview type setting.
Exactly. In the classical, we are on a break studio, again, from the sports stadium. We cut back to the stands. Here the host is. In this case, this was me. And then the professors from
the
stage.
The star player was being interviewed.
Yeah.
And then the delegations from each of the cities in China were allowed to, or had the opportunity to ask a couple of questions from the, not a player in this case, a transplant surgeon or someone like that, exactly, a professor. So it was a really interesting dialogue and very much that hybrid. You could argue that at that point, there is no in-person audience, so that's just a virtual event. But I don't want to get into semantics right here. I think that was a really smart use of, hey, professor just got off the stage delivering their keynote. These people in China saw the keynote. They have questions. They want to go deeper. And because they're part of this sponsored opportunity where they're in these like hubs all over, 100-person hubs or something, they have the opportunity to ask questions specific to them. And that provided, I think, incredible value for the people asking the questions and for the people in those rooms. I realized, the language was a bit challenging because you had this kind of simultaneous interpretation happening. And I think the questions, it's always challenging to get really clear dialogue going in situations like that. But I think it was an incredible use of everybody's time, which I think is the most important thing.
Yeah, and a few additional comments. Again, these people were physically hosted by the sponsor. In this case, a medical company, or a pharmaceutical company, I should say. They're always very interested in to get face-to-face contact with medical professionals as well. That was the one thing I'd like to add. And in terms of question asking, besides this exclusive right to have a conversation with the professors in the offstage studio, in general, for Q&A, that's the beauty of hybrid events. You can very easily blend your physical and online audience through the polling applications that are widely available, where people send in their questions on their mobile and give them a thumbs up. And now I start to talk as a MC moderator of events. I actually start to prefer those also with my physical audiences, because it allows much more people to enter into the conversation of Q&A. And I allow, because not everybody is as vocal to stand up in a big audience and raise their hand, but also it improves the quality of the questions, because I now select the questions that have the most thumbs up, instead of a random arm in the air of someone who just wants to share their own often slightly commercial kind of message and doesn't have a question. By the way, fellow moderators, there's a great way to put that down. If you have one of those, and it's mostly one of the first, you just then say, so what is your question? And then the rest knows that we do not like those type of interactions.
I think I saw a cartoon recently that says, somebody stands up exactly doing what you're describing and says, I'm going to ramble on for 2 minutes with a statement and a commercial statement masquerading as a question.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it often is. Let's put those down. But again, so back to the hybrid events, having these virtual Q&A tooling, whether it's in the event app, whether it's separate, these are nowadays very simple. A lot of audience members have experience with it, so it's a great addition. So, and that is both open, whether you're physically or remote. It doesn't really matter.
For sure.
I want to move to a next example, which goes deeper into this concept of co-located events. During 2021, where everything was a bit wobbly about what was allowed, what wasn't allowed, what could we do, we had an event for a big national association. It had multiple objectives. There was education involved, there was celebration involved, there was an award show, there was a quiz, there was just bringing that community together, multiple objectives or formats at the same time. At that time, the rule was that people were allowed to come together in groups to a maximum of 30. And another kind of design context parameter was that there was also like 7 to 8 sponsors, friends of the association that needed some kind of exposure. So this then led to a very, it's also not that new, but a hub and spoke format, where we would have a central studio where there was actually no physical audience at all. You could have added some VIPs very easily in a little studio, of course, but in this case, there was no physical audience. There, we had the speakers, we had the awardees, we had the band, we had the quiz, everything was this was really almost TV-like. Then at the 8 locations of the sponsors, there was a co-located event where 30 of these people were then physically together. They had the dinner, the catering, all the perks of that. And there was throughout the program several times, there was two-way or multi-way communication between us in the studio and the different locations located around the country. And I think that is a great format. Even you could also extrapolate that to an international setting, of course. Few benefits. Production costs at the physical location are lower because you don't have all these people there. Cost is not the main driver here because it's a pretty expensive format. I'll tell you why in a second. But it also in terms of traveling, sustainability, but also, let's say, comfort for the participants. If you can travel regionally to a physical event or a smaller physical event instead of doing the big travel, that's much more interesting. And also from the sponsors, they had these people in-house. It was at their office, in their location. That was a lot.
Was this an in-house corporate event or something else?
No, this was an association event also.
Association event, okay. Yeah. No, I find like the way you describe it to me sounds a little bit almost like the Eurovision, which I always find is like almost like the
there were those kind of moments like hey, we're now switching to how are you doing? And true.
And hello Sweden, how are you today?
Yeah, but hey, let's not forget, Miguel, we are still talking about designing events using recognizable formats. Hey, for Eurovision, for all sake, it doesn't matter. People understand what's going on, right? It can help.
For sure. Yeah. And you mentioned cost was quite high. Well, and I can imagine, right? Because lots of different transmissions from different places.
Again, this is a production choice. Mm-hmm. When we go to the ESOT example, there we facilitated the hubs. So we invited in this case, also sponsors to become a hub. We had like this information package. Here, this is what you should do. Be our guests. While at this 2021 event, from the production side, we took full responsibility for the co-located events. That means we also produced them. And then it becomes a bit of a different thing because then you now need to have people in all these different events, and you cannot afford to let anything go wrong. While in the other example, where you, let's say, facilitate with information and testing, if they mess up, in the end, you can always say, well, okay, I told you everything. It's a pity, but it's your loss because somehow you didn't have your act together. So this is a little bit of a production strategy choice you have to make. How much responsibility do you want to take for the remote locations?
I think that the really interesting kind of examples and variations. And I guess what I always find interesting is they're so different. I guess they're kind of like ticking different boxes, right? And you can, if you have all the production available everywhere, you could kind of always do everything. But it's really about which line do you take? Which choices do you make? Like, what's most important? Is it the interaction? Is it the fact that they don't need to travel all over the world? And I think in this last example that you gave us I find that a really valid example for being more sustainable and also, not forcing, particularly for like something like an internal company event, not forcing the whole company to travel to one location, especially if people are working remotely, a lot of people working from home. asking them to travel to their closest kind of regional office and having a pretty big deal event there may be just as good, rather than, all this expense and all this kind of, waste to get people to travel all around the world to one location.
Yeah, let me quickly repeat the example I told you last week in the summit, talking about corporate events. This was a big 2-day sales and marketing conference for a big international corporation. Obviously, the top 200 or so get invited to fly all the way from the world. These are the business group directors or the business group marketing directors. So the way this was run is plenary session, traditional sports television format, right? I had and this can be pretty low tech, so just a high table and a few extra lights in the back of the room while the room fills up. I'm talking to either the meeting owner or someone who's been part of the thing, and we kind of lead in to new colleagues what this event means, or what they can expect, or what the next 2 days are going to look like. Then as soon as the director and the CEO and everyone gets on stage, we just broadcast stage. We do live Q&A through the means we said. I represent the voice of the remote audience in the room by reading off questions which come in remotely. And I'm doing this rather quickly, but to me, this is basic level hybrid event, right? And then they had in the afternoon, and probably people involved in corporate events might recognize that, they had some kind of a marketplace where different either strategic projects in the company or business units who did something really creative were sharing best practices or updates or doing demonstrations. And they were a little bit struggling, like, how do we bring our virtual colleagues into that? And there we used a format that you and I have quite some experience with. We just had a roving camera with a wireless camera with a mic, and I just went in as their host, being their embedded employee colleague, by the way, and kind of taking them literally from stall to stall, doing a quick interview as if I were a participant consuming that marketplace, right? But now really being able to bring that virtual participant in. They were able to chat with me, to ask questions, to give me little challenges. Like I remember at some point, one of these marketplaces had a challenge of who could jump the highest. You had to take a sticky note and then jump and stick it as high as you could on the wall. So here, obviously, they started rooting me on in the chat. It's like, oh, Gerrit, do it for us. So I wrote my sticky note, virtual participants, and actually then had to jump as high as I could. Did pretty well. In the end, we got second place. But that, and later, that resonated so much, right? Everybody was like on their yammers and WhatsApp groups, and I was like, oh, this was so much fun, and I really felt part of it, and blah, blah, blah. So again, an example where you, with a creative format, with relatively low tech, but in this case, okay, let's not call myself a good, but someone who is able to bring a virtual audience into something, you can create something really nice.
Yeah, I think these are great examples. And is it common for you to do that kind of thing for social media, like we've done in the past, or is that kind of a less common thing to do these days?
Nope, it's back. No, but and we talk about our cooperations for IMEX, the big trade show here in the events industry. I think a lot of people who listen to this might be aware of that, but for those who are not, no, like I just mentioned last week, big theme at the dermatology conference, and so also the whole social media reporting, live content creation teams are also definitely again, that's almost the new normal, right? It's become a hygiene factor.
Do you feel that on social media, is there when you're working with clients, is there a kind of a metric or something that you look for when you say, hey, I think this is going to work on your social media, or actually this isn't going to work on social media, it'll fall flat? Like, how do you tell? Because I'm sure a lot of clients are like, hey, we're going to go on social media, it's going to be amazing, and everybody's going to watch it. Yeah. And then you're kind of like, that might not actually happen. Is it dependent on how active the social accounts are normally, or are there other factors that you kind of look for?
This is funny. You just changed this whole podcast topic from hybrid events back to social media. But let's see what I can say on that.
I think the two are quite interchangeable in many ways, right?
Because it just depends on where you're watching. Explain why to our audience. Because they are targeting a similar audience. namely people of your community who are not physically present at the event.
It's a good point, though, because I think that just because you're live streaming into a private platform that you have logged into, or you're live streaming onto a social media channel, you could argue that those two are very similar, right? They're the same thing, and one's an event and one's a live stream, but I think, again, it's semantics, right?
Agree. Yeah. And you're asking me whether I can quickly identify what is going to work. I find that a challenging question. I find it very curious
that you say that it's back, right? I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And I can understand to some perspective
but what I could say, let me add 2 occasions. This weekend, I was working on a big sporting event where there was no real dedicated social media team ready. But we did again, this is a sport event, a triathlon. So we did the athlete briefing in a Facebook Live instead of some kind of physical room where people had to gather while they were all over the place in their hotels and whatever. So that's why I had access to the Facebook and Instagram channels, and that then led to me also kind of feeling responsible to that. So, and since it wasn't my full role and responsibility, and I had a lot of other stuff to do, I then had to choose what is the bare essentials. And that's basically your question. So that is an interesting comment. So bare essential number 1 is customer care, right? So anybody who reaches out with questions, comments, complaints needs to be taken care of. Well, I was able to do that. Bare essential number 2 is definitely having something there 2 or 3 times a day during the event. Again, this was a multiple day event. Obviously, in the pre-event day, we had a briefing and a press conference. On the day itself, luckily, there was also photographers, so we were able to do some first live photographers. And again, you talked about the speed of publishing. This is such a nightmare for the professional photographers because they want to shoot and then go in and edit and select. And here the social media team is just give me anything. I need something on my feeds and stories right now. And you shoot. I agree with that. So let's at least have something. I was able to do that minimum. Yeah. And then just to finish off the conversation, and what I see happening now in the post-race day, back to customer care, people demanding, so where is the photo album? Where is all the stuff? When is all the content coming, right? And be quick.
Yeah. No, I think my question was slightly different, but I think it's really interesting that you went into that detail. It's more about when a client asks you to kind of get active on the social channels and transmit using their social feeds. Is there a time when you say this isn't going to work because nobody's following you? Or, you know what I mean? Like making that choice of like, are you sure this is a good, because I remember when we were working together, there was a lot of requests for this, and it was kind of like, I don't think that's going to work. You know, sometimes you have to kind of pull back and say, your social media accounts are dormant. Nobody follows you. Why would you want to stream on your social media accounts? You're like, that's a question that I think probably comes up.
Yeah, I agree. And so I think it's relatively simple. If they are dormant, the event is your best opportunity to change that.
To wake them up.
Right? Because again, talking about the momentum, if at any time during the year people are interested to start following you on social media, it's in the last week leading up to your event and during your event. And so if you then change the design, the strategy, the focus, and say, okay, let's change this, and I want to reach out to all that potential on social media, now is the time. I think in the end, it doesn't really matter whether you do not have a following yet. You need to be smart that at the places where you do communicate with your audience, you then underline that this is now happening. So and one of the best cases I've seen is the EAO, the European Association of Osseointegration, that I work with for many years. Once they decided to go really big on YouTube. And the next conference, they literally had the promo for their YouTube channel everywhere, on every emailing, on every website, on a bit of, but also physically in the event. I have this whole map still stored on my computer of all the outings at the conference, from the backs of the shirts of the volunteers to a badge on the physical badges. So on the lanyards, there was like a banner that said "Follow us on YouTube." Like banners in the venue, in the holding slides, everywhere. They were activating that audience. Like, we want you the rest of the years with us on YouTube. A whole other debate is whether putting all your scientific and smart content on YouTube is a smart thing. That is another choice. Obviously, YouTube has an enormous reach. On the other hand, you're competing with cat video. We know all the arguments why to do or not to do. And let's invite this listeners to this really long podcast now. If they want to go into that conversation, they reach
Absolutely.
out to us personally.
We may, this may be part 2 of the podcast, if you will, if that makes more sense. Quick, just on this one specific example, do you know if are they trying to then monetize their YouTube channel?
Nope. No. Not at all. They just say this is pure marketing. We want to reach as many people, dentists in their case, across the globe as we can. Yeah. And this is our fastest way to reach them, we believe.
I think it's an interesting choice. Like you said, medical things on YouTube is kind of a little gray area. It's a little bit, I'm sure it's highly qualified and good content, but how much of it?
And again, once they made that choice, the choice, it's available in almost all countries, not in all countries. In a lot of countries, it's available, definitely for their target audience. They can also justify, China is not a big market for them, so they're willing to make that sacrifice. It is very easily played on any device and anything, technologically very simple. Yes, you are competing with a lot of other videos, but now once they made this choice, it's a game of consistency. They have been leaning on this YouTube strategy for the last 4 or 5 years already, even pre-COVID. And if you just, like I said, we do the monthly Ask Me Anything. We do all the Congress reports. We do the hybrid. Their Congress is also hybrid in a sports style format. But then these breakfast sessions at the start of the day or the lunch break sessions in our little studio are also then republished on YouTube, but not all at once. Hey, we talked earlier in this podcast about should you be as fast as possible publishing? No, they say we drip feed. Right, we do every week. We have a new video online on our channels.
Yeah, I think if you're going for a community approach, then it makes sense. And exactly, it's like you capture all this amazing content. There's so many important people in your industry at those type of events. If you can capture that, and then those things are useful after the event. If they're only useful for that 1 week or 1 month, then it doesn't make sense. But if they are afterwards, then drip feed, it becomes the content that you play with for the rest of the year, which I think is very smart.
Right. It makes me think of another client. This is a corporate event again. They wanted to build their thought leadership in their specific industry. They had their big client event, which was, let's quote unquote say, classical. So speaker on stage, keynotes, blah, 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 demos, all stuff. And in the end, they never, they were a client pre-COVID. In the end, they never dared to go live. So what it turned into was the biggest content production day of the year. Exactly what you say. All the important people are there. All their clients from all the different industries were there. So we were there set up with 3 different teams. One team capturing the content from the main stage. One team with a behind the stage studio, that when a speaker would come off, they would immediately be sat down. They would be invited to do a summary interview of their keynote talk or presentation, and that was then edited into a piece where the interview was the teaser, and the long format was a blend between the talk and the quotes on stage. And then upstairs in the catering area, so to speak, we had another little small studio where account managers were just pulling in clients just to record all these client testimonials from the different industries and from the different stuff. And they pulled so much content from that one day of having everyone in one location. Yeah, I think it's the smartest thing you can ever do. And I think it's the biggest, not the biggest, one of the biggest lost opportunities I see a lot of event planners make. which I understand because a lot of people and also agencies who produce events or conferences are often not the same people who are responsible for content marketing. Mm-hmm. So that's why these worlds don't collide. But if you take any tip away from this, try to see if you can get the content marketers and the events people on the same table before the event and make a great content production plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Fully agree with you. I always think about that with many events, that you work so hard at bringing these people from all around the world together, and then you don't capture that in some ways. And it's not about capturing the stage. A lot of times it's capturing everybody else that's there and finding a way to kind of, cash in on that, or at least capture it for using later. So absolutely incredible.
And I think what we're doing now, the whole podcast, is a whole new world of opportunities, right? Make sure you have your podcast recording studio on site, get all these interesting people in there. Or if you create video interviews, see if you can record them in such a way that they're easily transmissible also as a podcast. Those are little smart things to think about.
Are you a big fan of podcast studios at events?
Yeah, from this vision, from having all the industry leaders, interesting people in one location. So let's capture that. Yes, I am.
Okay, interesting. What about, and this is sort of twisting that conversation a little bit, but what about the idea of pods, going back to sort of extremes in hybrid, pods where online audiences can connect with people that are there on site? I guess in a way, a sort of a podcast pod, but more of like a virtual meeting. I saw a comment recently on LinkedIn about somebody who's seen this happen at events and was very successful. And I think the majority of LinkedIn kind of said, it doesn't work when you're trying to connect the online and online audience. But some people say that it has worked and it works very well with certain situations or certain preparations or whatever.
Can you share a little bit more about this success case? Because my first response would be to knock it down as well, but that's not fair. If someone says this was a success, what made it successful?
I need to do some more research and find the one person who out of the comments said she knew of multiple occasions where it happened. And she kind of suggested that it was more about the preparation and setting things up in advance and making sure that people were aware that these pods were there. And I think from an accessibility and sort of inclusion perspective, it does make sense, right? Because if you're physically not able to go to an event and you have the opportunity to be on the virtual side of one of these pods, and you can get somebody to, interact with you, the person that you want to speak to interact with you, obviously there's a huge amount of value there. Now, whether you want to kind of force that or kind of make that happen at and during an event, I don't know if that's really beneficial, right?
That's where I'm struggling. I mean, back to the scale we talked about so much. A physical event is suited for experience. To me, online devices are often, let's say, a challenge or a threat to the quality of the physical experience. So why would you go out of your home, out of your office to a physical event venue where there's multi-sensory experiences in terms of design, color, food, smells, whatever, and then go either on your mobile or your laptop to do a Zoom call with someone else? Again, yes, there must be certain use cases where that is really useful, because the main purpose of this whole event is one-on-one conversations, and these are pre-scheduled. And in that case, if they're pre-scheduled, it shouldn't matter whether you're physically there or not. On the other hand, we could also argue, why would you then physically go to another place and not just have that Zoom meeting wherever you are, right? So that's where it kind of creates a shortcut connection in my mind. Is like, why would I go to a physical place to then go into an online meeting?
Yeah, it does feel like you could just book a call later on, right? To kind of make that work later.
I would say that. But again, maybe this is all has to do with momentum. So that could be a reason to do it. We said that before. We are touching on the topic of blending audiences, and I am aware, and I've been thrown at that I make it seem like they're really separated audience and have nothing together. Well, let's explore what they have together. Obviously, they have the same occasion together, momentum, date, time, place. Well, not place, but at least they're around the same content. So yes, on social media, on hashtags and all that stuff, it doesn't matter if you're physically online, you could encounter and find each other there. We talked earlier already about the Q&A tooling, where it doesn't matter whether you're physically or online in the room, where you could be a joint audience as well. And even back in the case of ESOT 2019, but also in many other events, obviously when there is a lot of investment in a big event app where the presentations are there, or the papers, or the posters, or the attendees and the filtering, obviously it could be very easy to share access to that same event app also with the remote participants, now allowing them to also participate into the virtual networking opportunities that the app offers, or the gaming that the app offers. So any encounters that would be facilitated through a mobile app on a physical event would then also be facilitated with a virtual participant. It also makes sense to make people pay for access to that. Also at ESOT, people had to pay a virtual ticket to get access to the app and all that stuff. Yeah. But yeah, we're touching on a fundamental here. And everything we say in this podcast, I might make it sound like it's black and white. Of course, let me repeat again, I'm super aware things are gray. But let's face it, how often do I really get a new encounter through a mobile app networking device? I must say, in my life, it hasn't happened that much. The only thing that I do find useful is kind of the filtering, where you can quickly say who else from my country is here, or who else from, right? If they have these kind of filters, and then you kind of know who to keep your eyes open to, or if you're a speaker, that helps, right? If you've been a speaker at an event, you've been on stage, everybody has seen you, but they haven't seen, or you haven't seen them, then this kind of helps because they can reach out to you. But let's face it, LinkedIn is a pretty good platform for that as well.
Absolutely. And you could argue that events are the ultimate filters in a way, because you're filtering out from the whole world audience those that are actually interested in a particular topic, or a part of those that are interested in a particular topic. So in the long-term thinking of, building connections, building a brand exposure, it all counts into the same kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Agree.
So any last examples that you want to share? Yes, we've been going for a long time. I want to start wrapping up, but any last examples that you think are crucial that we should not miss from the kind of overview of the value of hybrid events?
Yeah, well, let's add two short ones. I refer for the third time now to the 5 formats we have. Let's quickly list them off. One is the physical event being broadcasted, right? The televised sports stadium or conference or whatever, simple. But second format is to flip that around. Let's say we have a television studio, perhaps even with a live physical audience as well, but the focus is on the virtual audience, and the hosting and everything is done on camera.
So live TV in front of a studio audience, so to speak.
Right? Exactly. And one of the key tips I mentioned in the summit yesterday is, please, dear meeting owner, planner, producer, agency, whatever, make sure you choose who is the primary audience. And often that's determined by size. Often it's what audience is bigger. So in this example, in the corporate event, they had like their top 100, I think, in the room. They were the live audience to the studio because there were 1,200 people online. Well, you are nuts if you do not then decide, okay, let's flip it. We're going to host on camera. We'll talk to, obviously every now and then, if something would happen in the room, you can show that. But the primary audience in this case is a 1,200 people online audience. So make that choice to your hosts, to yourself, to your budget holder, to your suppliers. And those of you who now think, well, I really cannot make the choice. Well, then make sure you double up on teams, and make sure you have a dedicated team for the virtual audience and a dedicated team for the physical audience.
Absolutely.
Second format, I think I'm going to get lost on the phones. Let's take another one. Well, the third format is the hub and spoke. We talked that about. So a central studio, people on co-locations. Maybe one of the studio is also a 100, 200, 300 person event, but at least having multiple locations. Production-wise, super complex, but fun if it works. Another one is where you start to separate things in time, but in this case, still on the same day, but you use it to bring in your speakers twice. So I've been in this event, the National General Physician Association, where the plenary was live stream broadcasted, and then there was all these parallel sessions. And they had breakout rooms where the physical audience would have a physical breakout. And then they would have, I think, 2 parallel studios set up where there would be the virtual breakouts for the virtual audience. And the speakers would then do their session twice, once for the physical audience and one for the online audience. So you capture again on the fact that people have prepared a session, that they're there, but you do not create this awkward complexity in that breakout for that speaker, like who's my primary audience, who do I focus on, where do I look? You also limit yourself in production complexity. You have 2 dedicated online studios where you do.
Just to be clear, so the speakers are doing their breakout sessions in a live breakout and then in a studio, but the kind of the main stage sessions would be streamed the same.
Exactly. That was a classic plenary, 3 cameras or 4 cameras in the room, televised.
I think that's really smart, because it's one of those like behind the scenes production things where the virtual audience doesn't realize that the speaker is doing it twice. And unless the speaker decides to mention it, like nobody else does either, right? Only the production team and the event owners know that.
And the speaker knows, exactly. And the funny experience I had there, I was the main moderator in the plenary, but I was also asked to lead one of the breakout sessions. So I also had that experience of doing them twice. And I would definitely argue the physical breakout gets better because you're not distracted by, there's also a camera, I need to think and look and stay in the light and all that stuff. So that got better. But the interaction was very different. And this probably has to do with the raise your hand and ask a question thing versus live chat Q&A. In the virtual session, the audience there was a very different tone. Somehow they were much more critical, negative, a little bit nagging. And the beauty was, we also, from a speaker perspective, we just did the physical session. So we were warmed up, and that also for the quality of the video on demand content, we then did our online session. So that actually was better as well, because it was the second time we ran the thing.
Yeah, I was thinking in my mind that you could pre-record this and run them at the same time so that in the program you wouldn't even notice which one was which.
That's a nightmare for your speaker.
Yeah. Why? Because then you don't get the interaction, right? You're not, it's not an event.
Yeah, and I don't know how it's for you, but if you have to prepare for a presentation, again, the word momentum, and I think it should be in the title of the event, but also for you as a speaker, right? You work towards that day where you do the session and then everything come together. So for me to do a presentation to a physical audience and then do it again to a camera is much easier and lighter, and I'm full on in the zone than doing at some other time relevant, like a pre-record session, and then on the day do it again.
So that peak of interest is also important from the speaker's perspective. I think it's also
I would argue,
yeah.
I would argue. Yeah.
And the fifth style, what have you got for us?
Yeah, that's the one we mentioned really early, where you spread out and make a blend of virtual encounters and physical encounters. So let's say a series of webinars that lead up to a physical event or after, right?
That's when you take the removing of the time constraints to a whole other level, right? You're kind of saying, it doesn't matter if people are not at peak interest. Actually, I want to make it to a more of a continual, and in a way that's even more of a blend of the continuous learning with the live events, right? It's kind of a
fully agree. So now you see the 5 formats in the 1 and 2. We just do the same thing, but decide who's the primary audience. In 3, we say, well, let's take place away and let's put people in different places. In number 4, we start to play with time, where we just produce dedicated online sessions. And in 5, we really take away time and create some kind of a blend between virtual and physical events.
Brilliant, Gerrit. I want to wrap up because we have definitely enough content for 2 episodes, and maybe that's what this will become. We'll see. And but really appreciate.
And maybe I put you on the spot, Miguel, but maybe this podcast generates so much questions that we do a follow-up, 100% Ask Me Anything question-driven session as well.
Well, there you go. Then we just have a regular weekly show where we just do an Ask Me Anything on a weekly basis.
On hybrid events, yeah.
It'll be big on Reddit, right? We'll just let it explode. Great stuff, Gerrit. Really appreciate you sharing all this with us. Still want to get your recommendation for who else we should have on the podcast. We've had some fascinating guests, you being one of them, and would love to hear from you.
Yeah, and I must admit, I only recently caught on to the Event Manager podcast, so I'm still working my way back into the recordings. One of the beauties of podcast, it's timeless. You can, whatever you discover, you can go back and listen all to that. I've been giving this some thought, but in the end, let's keep it close to home. My business partner in live online events is Gerrit Schroeders, another horrible name, Gertie Schroeders. And after all these years in online events, she's also starting to develop her thoughts about, so if we have all these resources, if we have all these people together, how can we use events for good? She calls it philosophy for events. It has to do with all the important challenges of the industry at the moment, sustainability, diversity and inclusion. But in general, how can we start thinking and challenge ourselves to make the good choice? And then what is the good choice? That's the whole thing, the philosophical part about it. And she did a great session at IMEX Frankfurt 2022 about that. So I think it would be worthwhile to listen more to her about that.
Fascinating. We'll definitely invite her to come and share. This sounds like a really interesting angle, and I've heard of a few people trying to explore this, but it's not something that's that common. So I think it'd be really interesting to get her take on it.
Cool.
Appreciate the recommendation. Appreciate your time, Gerrit. Thank you once more. And everybody listening, look up Gerrit on social media. I think LinkedIn and Twitter are your favorite channels. I'm sure he'll be happy to connect.
I let the Twitter go a little bit, Miguel. So
Okay.
yeah,
LinkedIn.
Look me up on LinkedIn, definitely.
All right. Gerrit, been a pleasure. Thank you very much.